All right, in today's lesson, we're going to talk about the modern search for a planet X. Now, as we discussed in last week's lesson, the ancient knowledge of a planet X or a Nibiru is clearly documented in the Sumerian texts. But the idea of this Nibiru being a planet that we're looking for in current times takes on a new slant. And so we want to look at some of the modern research and kind of understand what we're leading up to and looking for a planet that would actually meet the Sumerian descriptions of this ancient Nibiru. So one of the things to obviously look at is evidence for the Great Flood. Now, what we have are maps going back well into our history that seem to show a very accurate representation, not only of our coastline, right, but, and here's the both poles, it's a flat map, but it also shows all of the types of like animals and various things that are found on these continents. So it's a very accurate representation of an aerial view from the sky, looking down at our continents. Now, no one that we knew of had the power of flight in ancient times. There was no ancient culture that was using like hot air balloons or anything of the like. So we really have to wonder what we're looking at here when we see this information about a great flood. Now, a lot of these things that relate to the idea of a great flood we find in various ancient maps that again show the topography of our North and South Pole pretty much accurately underneath the sheets of ice. Now, this is very hard to conceive of because, one, you would need to have an aerial view to look down at the continents, and two, more importantly, you would need ground penetrating radar to know the actual land mass versus the ice and differentiate between the two. So we do have a significant amount of data that comes out of the sedimentary layers, the geological evidence, to say, yes, there appears to have been a large flood, let's say 10 to 13,000 years ago, looking at sedimentary layers, as well as the understanding that, some of these ancient texts that talk about Planet X or Nibiru say that one of the large ice sheets, when Nibiru last passed by thousands of years ago, caused this great flood. So obviously we'd want to pay attention to the idea of a Nibiru or a Planet X from the standpoint that it is attached to our cosmology, forming of our planet, catastrophic changes to our planet. But to say when these things will happen again, we need to first identify the real Planet X Nibiru. Now, if we look at some of these other artifacts, again, that confirm this story of the Sumerian tale of a great flood, we have to understand that this is probably not mythological information. We can start to look at the geological evidence as well as new space data, things that we're looking at for actually looking for extrasolar planets. And to do this, we need to first understand the tools we currently have available. So it is interesting, again, to denote a lot of the information that was told to us by the Sumerians about this shining cross in the sky, the symbol for Nibiru, where the ancient gods came from. Now, if we're actually able to find this planet within our own lifetime, a planet that's 4 to 8 times the size of Earth, then we might be in for some very interesting cultural changes when we realize there's possibly another civilization living on this planet. That's what all the ancient texts tell us, is that these beings, the Anunnaki, came from this planet, Nibiru. So if we're ever actually able to find the real Nibiru, which is, again, 4 to 8 times the size of Earth, a very large planet, if we're ever able to find this planet, we might be in for some very interesting realizations that we aren't alone in the solar system. Now, again, we've looked at some of these Sumerian artifacts, and we have to realize really the main point about the Sumerian evidence is this is well before our understandings of modern technology. 6,000 years ago, this Sumerian culture has lots of evidence, which is in alignment with many other ancient cultures that speak of a time when they were visited by the gods. The difference is that they've left us so many texts and artifacts that we can now confirm with our modern science when they talk about the distance between the planets or what the planets look like in space. So when they talk about this additional planet, Nibiru, we really need to take a step back and try and understand what they were trying to tell us. Now, a lot of these these symbolic references that they've left us in the cylinder seals and the clay tablets, we've been able to identify what a lot of these mean. This winged disc, the symbol of Nibiru, the 7 dots of Earth representing, Earth, the 7 dots representing Earth, the sacred number 7, 7 days in a week. All of these, again, come from this base of information which was bequeathed to the Sumerians by the Anunnaki that claimed they came from this other planet, Nibiru. So when we look at a lot of these references of interactions between the Sumerians and the Anunnaki, they're giving us kind of like a pictogram overview. Just like in hieroglyphics, the Egyptians were able to use one symbol and convey maybe several words. Today we would call that an acronym, like CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, or FYI, for your information. Sometimes these symbols of the winged disc or various other pieces of this slate are meant to represent more than just one word. It's actually, a picture is worth 1,000 words, as that saying goes. So it really is interesting to take note of some of the pieces of evidence that we see over and over as hieroglyphics or pictograms shown in the Sumerian information. Because a lot of the references do take on a meaning in scientific terms, we just need to unravel the meaning. A lot of that symbology that they've left us about the Anunnaki, they were commanders of a spaceport if they had this symbolic headdress. We see that they appear to be wearing watches and having, things that would almost be a technological layer, even if ancient man didn't understand what these things were. What they saw the gods doing and using, they seem to have been very able to accurately represent a lot of the information and things that were happening in their time. And again, this symbol of Apollo 11 does make sense to us, right? We understand that we're just symbolizing the power of flight. So all of these references for winged discs or, winged beings, we have to understand that it's not mythology. Ancient man went to great lengths to convey that they had the power of flight. They were coming from the skies here. But that's not the only place they say they came from, the skies, right? Very specifically, the Anunnaki came from Nibiru, another planet within our solar system. All the astronomical data that we can confirm with our sciences today is confirming what they've said. So we should really dive into these topics. Now, as I've mentioned, many of the biblical tales, many of the Sumerian texts recorded movements of the heavens over hundreds of years, sometimes thousands of years, as sacred astronomical data that was only handed down to the high priests. So this has been preserved, and now that our modern science is caught up to the point where our telescopes and our mathematics can calculate these vast distances, we're now starting to see that it confirms a lot of the information told to us by these ancient cultures. This one obviously is, a very infamous tale, and I think I've mentioned this in the previous lessons. The Enuma Elish, or this longer epic of creation. In the Bible there were 7 days of creation, right? In the Sumerian version we have 7 tablets of creation. And it goes into a very specific story about the cosmology of our solar system, how the planets came into being, how life and us came into being here on Earth. So it's a very interesting tale when we look at the aspects of how it explains the story of Nibiru, Planet X, how an intruder planet gets pulled in and is gravitationally attracted to the planets and has this interaction with our primitive Earth. So we must understand that, again, this information is recorded in stone. Our science today is now starting to further confirm what was written down thousands of years ago. The Sumerians were very specific in explaining that these beings, the Anunnaki, came from another planet within our own solar system, Nibiru, which stood for a glowing cross in the sky. And this, of course, was 4,000 years before Christ, Jesus on the cross. So it's very interesting information when we look at all of the astronomical data that we can now confirm that they've left to us. A lot of that information in the Sumerian pieces of Nibiru and Planet X was brought out by a scholar named Zecharia Sitchin. And now while Zachariah was an accomplished author, he was also a well-established historian and researcher, and spent many times in the field, researching this data, taking groups of people with him as well. And one of these, missions that he went on was he went and confirmed and collaborated with NASA about the Sumerian model for a Planet X, and how that is in alignment with some of the current data at that time in the late 80s, early 90s, for the Naval Observatory, and meeting with the lead naval astronomer. So here is actual video clip of when Zachariah Sitchin met on camera with the Dr. Harrington.
You wish to tell us in a few minutes the nature of those discoveries?
I'd be happy to, and you're absolutely right. As a matter of fact, the date on here, I was just noticing, is 14 August 1978, which was just about 6 weeks after we discovered the fact that Pluto has a satellite. Once you have a satellite for a planet, you can determine how heavy it is. It turns out Pluto was very much smaller and lighter weight than we had thought, which meant that Pluto has no influence, no appreciable influence on the motions of the planets Uranus and Neptune. At that point, we voiced the hypothesis that this means that there is at least one yet to be discovered planet in the outer reaches of the solar system.
So there you have it. I mean, that's on camera, Dr. Harrington speaking with Zachariah Sitchin. And again, Dr. Harrington was the lead naval astronomer for NASA at the time. And his model, basically as a three-dimensional model, showed Nibiru, or Planet X, as he would call it, on this elongated orbit. Very similar to the Sumerians' descriptions of, again, Nibiru being on a very elongated orbit, which takes it 3,600 years to complete one cycle around our sun. Now that must mean that there might be a second sun or something else that's allowing it to loop back around, which we'll discuss later on in this lesson. But there we have on camera Zachariah Sitchin and Dr. Harrington discussing the two models for the ancient Nibiru and the modern Planet X. And this isn't new. I mean, we've had many scholars that have started to look at the various orbits of our planets pretty much right as we started to come out of the Dark Ages and back into the Renaissance age. All of this new information was being rediscovered, what was well known by the Sumerians thousands of years ago. We lost this information. We somehow forgot it as a civilization, as a culture. And now we're rediscovering it through the time of Renaissance eras and Copernicus and Galileo. It's a norm that the Earth isn't the center, it's the sun, and we orbit around the sun. Somehow the Sumerians knew all of this information accurately thousands of years ago. But the kicker is that they also described another planet, Nibiru, Planet X, which we still have yet to discover. So here again is a tablet that you can see is, again, thousands of years old, and we have the sun accurately represented in the center, and all of the planets that we currently know of in their correct size and position, but with one additional planet, Nibiru. So they counted the planets that we know of today, but they also counted one additional planet labeled X here, Planet X. And it's always, again, interesting to note that we think we're the third rock from the sun, but if you count coming outside the solar system in, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Earth is the 7th planet. So anyone coming in to our solar system from outside, right, they say, well, you're on the 7th planet. And that's why Earth is labeled Ki by the Sumerians, the 7th planet. Now, science didn't even recognize the idea of an elongated orbit, something with an egg-shaped orbit. They just didn't even have any evidence of this until in recent times when Hubble found, sure enough, not our solar system, but another planet orbiting around another star, and it has an elliptical orbit. So it started to slowly creep into the consciousness of our space sciences that these things are actually possible. A planet that could orbit our sun in a 3,600-year orbit is a scientific possibility now. Now, there has been the idea put forth too that maybe Nibiru exploded, that Planet X doesn't exist anymore. And this is because if we look at all the fragmentation on our various inner planets, even our moon is cratered by debris that has been hitting it, Mars as well. So we have to wonder if there isn't some type of large explosion that took place in the past. Well, maybe, but all the evidence to the contrary says that Nibiru does exist as a planet still intact because the Anunnaki live on this planet. Now, there was an excellent researcher named Dr. Thomas Van Flanderen that wrote a book about this planet, this exploded planet hypothesis. And while I disagreed with Dr. Van Flanderen, he did bring up some interesting points that should be of note. This heavy cratering of all these planets that we have in our solar system really does and should raise questions about are we in danger of threats from space, whether it be the return of Nibiru or possibly asteroids and comets. So that's something else I'm going to touch on in this lesson. But I don't think that Nibiru actually blew up. I think that in the past, as the Sumerian creation tales explain, Nibiru, the main moon of Nibiru, had this collision and caused our Earth to go into the orbit it's in now. And we'll kind of just dive into this information. But, a lot of this information that confirms the Sumerian descriptions for a Nibiru, or as we would call it, a planet X, simply because it's X unknown, but the 9 planets we know of, and then X, making it number 10, the Roman numeral 10 is an X. Even though Pluto was demoted, we're not going to even go there. So there is data to suggest that NASA has been looking for and identified the possibility of another planet within our own solar system. It started with Dr. Harrington, but he was looking at orbital perturbations. Basically, everything in our solar system, even satellites that we would launch, were being pulled in a certain direction within space. This gravitational influence couldn't be accounted for. So they said, well, there must be some large body that was once here or is in an orbit that we still haven't found that caused all these gravitational influences, and even could possibly explain some of the anomalies within our solar system. Uranus is tilted on its side. Pluto and Neptune are possibly dislodged moons of Saturn that are now in the orbit that they're at. So just a lot of these solar system anomalies were explained at the time by Dr. Harrington by saying an intruder planet, by having this intruder planet go through the inner part of our solar system, it can explain with one orbit all of the anomalies that we currently have in our solar system. Now that model has changed, and we've moved on from orbital perturbations to infrared technology, where we have super cool telescopes sitting in space that are kept at a below freezing temperature, and then using infrared they can adjust their temperature frequency to pierce deep into space, well beyond what Hubble and some of these initial telescopes could do. And sure enough, we're starting to see a bunch of different worlds floating out there. And so that's what starts to bring up this idea that there is, in modern times, another planet within our solar system, a planet X. We're still looking for it. Now, you can see that this is a diagram from an Encyclopedia Britannica, which my father used to sell Encyclopedia Britannicas, and that's how I was raised, essentially, is my dad was a book salesman. And I remember several years ago when I found this diagram, I was amazed to know that even Encyclopedia Britannica in the 80s documented the idea that there is a 10th planet. The Pioneer 10 probe, and even the Voyager probe, but you can see the two Pioneer 10 and 11 probes in this diagram from the Encyclopedia Britannica show a 10th planet. They even show a second sun, right? This isn't new information, folks. It's not something that the scientific community can boldly accept, but understand that it is a scientific norm and has been well documented within acceptable resources. Now, the Harvard astronomical community has also been documenting and keeping note of where a planet X might be. These various Harvard abstracts show plates of the sky and marked points of where they think this Nibiru or a planet X could be located. So it is interesting, again, to look at some of the current data and search for this planet X, because, if we do actually find this planet 4 to 8 times the size of Earth within our own solar system, it's time to pay attention, folks, because the game will change. Now, as I mentioned, we do have several different telescopes that we've launched into space, and some of them have some very interesting technology. One of them was originally launched recently. It was called Certif. We recently just renamed it to Spitzer after a famous astronomer that passed away. Excuse me. But the Spitzer telescope is amazing, again, because it's the most advanced infrared telescope that we have. It's able to pierce these dense layers of debris that are millions and billions of miles out in space. And since it's infrared, it can tune its temperature to the same temperature of, let's say, this debris field and pierce right through it, again, using infrared technology. So we're going to continue to launch packages into space that are going to allow us to have the capabilities to start to see deeper and deeper into the universe and have better understandings of things that are floating around in our current solar system. Right now we've detected many extrasolar planets. We've called them Xena and Quoar and Sedna, but these are all, in my opinion, just large balls of ice, 800 to 1,000 kilometers in diameter, mostly frozen surface content. Nothing 4 to 8 times the size of Earth. But I trust, folks, that the telescopes and things that we will be launching, we will clearly be able to see a planet 4 to 8 times the size of Earth. So it is very interesting to pay attention to the type of technology that we are launching through our subconglomerate space agencies, NASA, Jet Propulsion Laboratories, Goddard Space Center. There's about a handful of them in the US. So I definitely recommend that it is your responsibility, if you're interested in the ancient astronaut theory, to know where we've gone in the past. We also must know where we're headed in the future. So that you understand, there are several different planet classifications, and the one that we're really interested in is here, a brown dwarf. Our sun right now is a large, full of energy planetary source. But there are other classifications. Just like Jupiter is a gas giant, there are other types of suns, for instance, a brown dwarf, where it was once a very large heat-generating sun, but it's lost its energy and capacity and shrinks to a certain size. Our second sun is more than likely now a brown dwarf. Nibiru might still be orbiting around that brown dwarf and coming back towards the inner part of our solar system every 3,600 years, according to the Sumerian information. Okay, now what's really interesting to note is that we have technology spread all over the planet and in space of various types of telescopes for us to do some very accurate models of things that we're looking at in space. The Keck interferometer is great. It takes 2 independent points and looks at one specific location to create a 3D model of what they're looking at, a star or a certain area in space. But as we've seen over the last 10 years, the idea that there is something else out there, this has been coming over and over, coming out in the news. A mystery revolves around the sun. A 10th planet. Something is there. So this information has been reinvigorated in the last decade or so, and it is interesting to note that it is directly in alignment with what we have about the ancient Nibiru. So if we do find a planet 4 to 8 times the size of Earth, some interesting things might happen. Now, there is other information to support the idea of a large planet or some type of second sun being attached to our solar system. Now, one of the ideas that we have is that there was an extinction level event that was caused by a massive asteroid or comet impact in the past. The main proponent of this is called the Nemesis theory. This gentleman, Dr. Richard Mueller, who is a physicist at Berkeley, proposed the idea that you can see here, that there is a large orbital planet that he calls Nemesis, and it orbits well into what is this debris field you'd see here is called the Oort cloud. So it's a scientific known fact that our solar system, billions of miles out from it, has another asteroid belt called the Oort cloud, and there's all kinds of floating debris and just comets and asteroids that they think generate from this Oort cloud and are periodically brought to the inner part of our solar system. How? One of the ideas put forth is that there's this Nemesis planet, a large planet on an orbit that takes it through the inner part of our solar system and well out into the Oort cloud, where it would pick up debris, and the gravitational effects of going through such a large asteroid field, well, it's going to bring it along with it to the inner part of the solar system. And so that brings an interesting model in the idea that a lot of these things that we see floating out there in space could possibly, if they are a part of our solar system, let's say, a planet X, it's also going to be bringing debris along with it. So one of the ideas for Dr. Mueller's theory is that there is a second sun, and that Nemesis actually is orbiting not around our sun, but two suns. And that's why it's very difficult for us to detect this planet. But Dr. Mueller is actually hitting on 2 points that I want to stress here. One, of course, is Nibiru and Planet X, the main focus of this lesson. But the other one is the idea that we have a second sun. Okay? Over 30 cultures reference the fact that we have two suns. There was a very high esoteric knowledge book written called Hamlet's Mill. I have yet to own a copy. It's well out of print. But it documents over 30 ancient cultures were aware of us having two suns, and that the orbit of these two suns, the suns being at their farthest point or the suns being at their closest point, have an impact on the rise and fall of civilization here on Earth. When the two suns are at their closest point, we're in the Golden Age. Everyone's heard of the Golden Age. When the suns are at their farthest point from each other, we're in the Dark Ages. And this seems to repeat here over and over on Earth in a large 24,000-year cycle. Now, right now, that scientific term is called the precession of the equinox. We've divided the heavens into 12 parts, 12 constellations, 12 different zodiacal symbols. Again, the breakdown of the heavens into 12 parts was first given to us by the Sumerian culture, who say that they were taught this by the Anunnaki. And where do the Anunnaki come from? The 12th planet. 12 hours in a day, 12 months in a year, 12 inches in a foot, coming from the 12th planet. So it's very interesting that we have to understand that there is a lot of scientific crossover for the idea that, one, we have two suns, but that for today's focus, that there is the possibility of a planet X looping around our second sun, having a 3,600-year orbit, and making that a scientific possibility. So I think it is interesting to note that this lost cycle of time, talking about the idea that we have two suns, is an interesting model that does collaborate and help put into existence the idea of a Nibiru. Nibiru can't orbit, billions of miles out into deep space without having some other source to be looping back around. So all of our current science is showing we're probably a binary solar system. Most of the solar systems that we film externally from Mars with Hubble and Spitzer and various other telescopes, we see that they're in this intricate dance. 2 suns, 4, 6, sometimes even more, all in an amazing orbit around each other. Suns in orbit around each other. So it's very possible we are in fact binary. Folks, this changes the whole game. If we can prove that we're a binary solar system, we have to understand that if our sun is orbiting a second sun, binary, meaning the 2 suns are in orbit, right? This is heavy. If our sun is orbiting a second sun over a very large cycle of time, we in fact are moving through space with our sun. If our sun is orbiting another sun while we're going around our sun, we're moving along through space with it. That changes the whole perspective of how our current sciences observe the precession of the equinox. It's this lunar solar theory where they think there's a wobble in our Earth that degrades the orbit over 72 years by 1 degree. It's a very inaccurate model of our current precession of the equinox. The new model put forth and looked at by the Binary Research Institute and many other scholars studying this idea that there is this ancient cycle. The ancient Hindus and Indians called this the yugas, the cycle of the great year. Even Plato called it the great year. So there were many cultures, in fact over 30 ancient cultures, were aware of this binary orbit and said that's what controlled this larger cycle of time. Just like the Mayan calendar was a much larger cycle of time, awareness of a much larger cycle of time. They're speaking about this information, the binary orbit of our two suns. That's why we go through every 2,000 years a new zodiacal symbol. Right now we're in the age of Pisces, that symbol of a fish. You might even see that symbol of a fish on someone's card. What they think they're symbolizing is Jesus. Well, that's been a symbol around well before Jesus as the age of Pisces, an astronomical marker. And very soon, in about 150 years, we're going to go into the age of Aquarius. So we're at a precipice, a point of change, where we're coming out of the Dark Ages and going towards the Golden Age once again. Unfortunately, we're very far away from the Golden Age, but I think everyone can feel that change is happening. Our sciences and knowledge is exponentially increasing. Here again, evidence of two suns. This is the famous Tower of Babel, right? Building a tower to get to the heavens, where there are two suns. Many ancient cultures knew this information as a fact. We are now relearning this information. So the whole idea of a Nibiru makes an interesting correlation to the idea that it would be going around two suns. Now, this cycle of the great year, again, is spoken about by many ancient cultures. And the ancient Vedic texts and the Hindu scriptures are the ones of most interest to me right now, because I too want to learn. And this information, again, is thousands of years into our past, shared by each culture, and probably the reason why various megalithic monuments are built to align to constellations in the sky that repeat. It's a marker in time to say where they were in this larger celestial clock. So we have to understand, just as a simple analogy, that we only live for about 120 years if we're lucky. Based on our current sciences, things are going to change in our lifetime. We're going to have longer lifespans. 120 years is probably reasonable. But if you think about that in the scale of 24,000 years, what's 120 years? It's a blip on the map. Here's an insect that we can put into perspective so that we understand these 24,000 year cycles affect humanity. How do we put that into perspective? This insect only lives 24 hours. So the mayfly, let's say another mayfly comes up to this one and it's a cloudy day and there's no wind or sunshine. And the mayfly says to the other one, I've heard this rumor of the sun and heat and breeze and wind, but I don't see it. And then they die 24 hours later. Just because that day it wasn't sunny or there wasn't a breeze doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And that's exactly the perils that we have now in understanding what the ancients have been telling us, and went to great lengths to mark why there is this large cycle of time. Folks, it seems that the orbit of our two suns have an effect on us. And when our suns are at their closest point, the energy of our suns, or something happens where we go into a golden age. Our brains and our ability to evolve goes into an exponential state of growth. And at that point, of course, we're interacting with aliens and higher life forms and interdimensional beings, what have you. Right now, we don't have that capability. Those interactions are limited. We are relearning this information. So just understand that when you look up in the heavens and look at the night sky, the breakdown of the heavens into 12 parts by the ancients is something that was done for a reason. This sacred knowledge has been encoded into monuments all over the earth to track where they were in this cycle of time. Even the ancient Sumerians had these, astronomical symbols of various zodiacal references that they put on sacred art and precious stones. So I think it's interesting to note that various things that they were marking as times and place of events that took place in the past weren't always because it was the gods were here. Maybe there were also catastrophic events and pinpointed events in time in our past that could possibly happen again. Planets orbit, seasons change, everything is cyclical. If an asteroid or a comet has struck the Earth in the past, maybe this happens over thousands of years, and there are preordained times that we need to learn and understand these patterns. Now, in my lifetime, just about a decade ago, there were, Shoemaker-Levy 9. We had a large comet that broke up into 9 pieces and impacted Jupiter in such a way that just these spots alone could fit 4 to 8 Earths, about the size of Nibiru, right inside of Jupiter. When this impact took place, NASA said, you know what? There's not going to be really anything to see. Shoemaker-Levy 9 is going to break up into some fragments and hit Jupiter. It won't be anything big. No big deal. No big deal. Talk about a solar system event. Again, the fragmentation of when it hit Jupiter left scars 4 to 8 times the size of Earth with each of these locations. I'd say that's a pretty big deal. Okay? So there have been things that happened in our solar system in the past that we can track with our sciences. We should definitely pay attention for God for say something happens within our own lifetime. Now, we do not have enough of a tracking program currently tracking what potentially could happen. Our near-Earth asteroid program is well underfunded. But having said that, I do think that there is another layer of protection by the Anunnaki or by the ancient beings, these gods that have protected us and been with and helped and pushed our civilizations along. I don't think that they would allow another major extinction level event on our current path. But I don't know. So it is very interesting, I think, to pay attention to some of these stories and things in the past, because as you can see, if you Google Planet X right now on the internet, there are people claiming to take pictures of Planet X by the sun with their webcam, or they see something that they think is the Planet X that's been sitting in the same spot for months. That doesn't happen. So we have to understand that there is a very large astronomical community of amateur astronomers all over the Earth, and anything that we've ever seen, Hale-Bopp, Shoemaker-Levy 9, as I just showed you, these were all first seen by amateur astronomers and then escalated to the professional community. I guarantee you, if we ever see a planet 4 to 8 times the size of Earth, anywhere near the inner part of our solar system, meaning on a trajectory that will bring it near us, we're going to probably see it years out. Now, that's not to say that we don't already know where Nibiru is and are not privately calculating when it will return, and maybe something bad will happen. I really don't know. And I guarantee you, folks, as honest as I'm being with you with my resources and knowledge, anyone else writing a book or telling you in their lecture that they know when Nibiru is going to return, they are not telling you the truth. Our sciences will be able to detect this planet if it does exist. So keep your eyes peeled to the sky and pay attention to what we're doing with our space sciences. All right, folks, thank you again, and stay tuned for next week's lesson from Ancient School. All right, in today's lesson, we're going to talk about the modern search for a Planet X. Now, as we discussed in last week's lesson, the ancient knowledge of a Planet X or a Nibiru is clearly documented in the Sumerian texts. But the idea of this Nibiru being a planet that we're looking for in current times takes on a new slant. And so we want to look at some of the modern research and kind of understand what we're leading up to and looking for a planet that would actually meet the Sumerian descriptions of this ancient Nibiru. So one of the things to obviously look at is evidence for the Great Flood. Now, what we have are maps going back well into our history that seem to show a very accurate representation of Nibiru, say that one of the large ice sheets when Nibiru last passed by, thousands of years ago, caused this great flood. So obviously we'd want to pay attention to the idea of a Nibiru or a planet X from the standpoint that it is attached to our cosmology, forming of our planet, catastrophic changes to our planet. But to say when these things will happen again, we need to first identify the real planet X Nibiru. Now, if we look at some of these other artifacts, again, that confirm this story of the Sumerian tale of a great flood, we have to understand that this is probably not mythological information. We can start to look at the geological evidence, not only of our coastline, right, but, and here's both poles, it's a flat map, but it also shows all of the types of like animals and various things that are found on these continents. So it's a very accurate representation of an aerial view from the sky, looking down at our continents. Now, no one that we knew of had the power of flight in ancient times. There was no ancient culture that was using like hot air balloons or anything of the like. So we really have to wonder what we're looking at here when we see this information about a great flood. Now, a lot of these things that relate to the idea of a great flood we find in various ancient maps that again show the topography as well as new space data, things that we're looking at for actually looking for extrasolar planets. And to do this, we need to first understand the tools we currently have available. So it is interesting again to denote a lot of the information that was told to us by the Sumerians about this shining cross in the sky, the symbol for Nibiru, where the ancient gods came from. Now, if we're actually able to find this planet within our own lifetime, a planet that's 4 to 8 times the size of Earth, then we might be in for some very interesting cultural changes when we realize there's possibly another civilization living on this planet. That's what all the ancient texts tell us, is that of our North and South Pole, pretty much accurately underneath the sheets of ice. Now, this is very hard to conceive of because, one, you would need to have an aerial view to look down at the continents, and two, more importantly, you would need ground-penetrating radar to know the actual landmass versus the ice and differentiate between the two. So we do have a significant amount of data that comes out of the sedimentary layers, the geological evidence, to say, yes, there appears to have been a large flood, let's say 10 to 13,000 years ago, looking at sedimentary layers, as well as the understanding that, some of these ancient texts that talk about Planet X or